Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 53. This session is going to be focusing on a broader topic, more of a collective topic. Terrence Mckenna's time wave or novelty wave theory. Without getting too far into it, this theory involves influences well beyond McKenna. And to really set the precedent of what went into, what created this theory, what made it feasible, the ideas therein, we have to follow a more ancient history for one, and that is that of the I Ching. So the general gambit of this session is a mention of the I Ching and its historical significance, a mention of the influence of Alfred Whitehead, and lastly, McKenna's implication of the eschaton. For those that are unfamiliar, Terrence Mckenna, as a scholar, as an academic, as an influence, went about some of his final years propounding this time wave theory and brought it together with the apocalypse, the Mayan calendar as it was popularized closer to 2012. And since it became associated with this doomsdayishness, lack of a better way to put it, it kind of fell flat on its face now that we exist well beyond 2012. So what I want to do is I want to focus on the merits of this and not to just simply disregard all that McKenna was bringing to the table simply because of this associative 2012 apocalypse. So let's begin. When making the theory, it wasn't a secret that the I Ching was very much a part of how it all came together. So let's talk about it. The I Ching is, by historical reference, at least 3,000 years old. And it was a form of divination that started with oracle bones. And these are still being unearthed by archaeologists. Ancient Eastern divination eventually making itself into the I Ching. So since the dawn of human society, right, this I Ching has had a certain sway, whether it was in its predecessive form or whether it became its full structure. This is all a great study of the yin-yang. When you're investigating the I Ching, it's always a derivation or a remix of the different yin and yang forces stacked on top of each other. You have a line that's designated as yin, and you have another, I think it's a broken line. The broken line is yin, and the full line is yang. And you create a hexagram, 6, to equate to your reading. So the yin, nurturing, feminine, yielding, broken line versus masculine, solid, aggressive, active. These two playing into all things, and this is something that we've discussed before in the course. We tend to think of masculine and feminine as purely a matter of gender or sex. However, the various parts of the body, the mouth is an intake, generally speaking, with exception to words, right? And that is yin. When you hold something in your hands, that is yin, and when you throw something, that is yang. Every anatomical structure has vessels, has openings, and it has closings. It has these different forces, yin and yang, flexing. The heart opens and clenches, opens and clenches. This is in everything. The yin yang is in everything. So it's quite the metaphysical duality. Oh, so when speaking of the I Ching, it's very natural how you can see that this flows very seamlessly into Tai Chi. It flows very seamlessly into Taoism. This understanding, and it flows into all corners in some way, shape, or form, into any Eastern philosophy, ancient philosophies. And what's important here too is the cycles. They're patterns of the yin yang and how they're stacked on top of each other, creating these different patterns. But here's the thing, there's only so many patterns. This creates many philosophical questions, right? If there's only so many patterns, then what is the nature of change? Well, how much change is there really? I mean, it could be like this and it can be like that, but it can't be like another. It seems to give a structure. And for those that don't know, the book I Ching is known as the Book of Changes. That's what this is all about. So to get down to it some more, how does the divination actually happen? Well, it was done through the bones and in one fashion. That's the old fashion. And then eventually it gave way to the coins and, the two sides of the coin. Okay, so when you throw 3 coins, you take measure of what sides they land on. And there are numerical values given to each. And you add up these numbers, which with each throw of 3 coins, and you do that a few times over until you create your own hexagram. This is the tool of reaching a, say, piece of advice, a guidance as to what's happening now. And for those that haven't done this form of divination, personally, I found it to be quite telling, very auspicious. It might be more resonant than one might assume if you give it the old honest try. So this divination aspect bleeds back in many ways that I feel that we should mention before continuing. To be in the ancient world and to know the exact moment that the sun will rise. To be in the ancient world and to be able to tell when a high tide is going to come in. This was a preoccupation. In the history of astrology talk I gave a long time ago, right? It's just, I've hammered the point across where it was a preoccupation of the ancients to want to know if the fields will flood. You should take an early harvest if you can know that it's going to go to waste. This is directly tied to the survival of your people and or even the wealth of your people. And so who amongst us can come up with the wisdom to tell us what will happen so that we can best suit our survival, best be comfortable in existence? And so this leads way to this kind of mathematic, this book of changes, or it leads way to certain, magic, wizardry, right? Like, if you don't understand their methods, then we'll just call it magic or wizardry. And they're not using methods that we contemporaneously associate with, like, orthodox, traditional methods with credo. So if they're using a completely different type of knowledge, a completely different way to come to realizations about reality, it's alien. It's alien to us, and we would generally disregard it as some weird hooey. And not even try it out, not even give it that try, not even try to understand the language of which it is operating from, or the basis of knowledge that it's operating from. So it's to say too that if we subscribe to this method of the I Ching, then all things are subject to the same patterns of change or processes, that they are a kind of rhythmic song that will play these notes at distinct times. And it doesn't matter, we are not separate from it, and anything that we can observe is not separate from it. Everything is included in these changes, these processes. So if only we could understand those such processes, then we can understand the very nature of change itself. And that these processes won't change. That's the kind of paradox here, is that these are the things that don't change. Yeah, let's try to put that in a way that's linguistically confounding. The only thing that doesn't change is change itself, right? That's kind of a weird idiom. Or the only thing that is constant are the processes of change. And so how can we align ourselves with these processes? And this is where the divination and its whole construction is coming from. And also, again, I mentioned Taoism. This is what ultimately Taoism is all about. The Tao is the way, and with that, it's the way of the changes. It's the way of reality. So reality is those processes. So how to best live alongside those processes? Ooh. So, you do the divination, you throw it out, right? And you make your hexagram. And this is going to give you a readout that will tie it to nature in some way. Some of them are like the wind at a mountaintop, or the harsh wind on the mellow waters. That anything that you're experiencing internally is a physical happening of nature as well. How do you think it would feel to be a still water roughed by a harsh wind? How would that feel if it was an internal sensation? And that's the trick, is that is your internal situation. That maybe, and here's an old shamanistic thing, maybe the desolation of nature is what's creating the desolation of the internal human experience. When corporate, consumerist, capitalist, or whatever regimes come through to pollute waters, you see the natives come by and, these are sacred waters. Well, okay, what's up with that? Well, if you pollute these waters, you pollute us. You pollute us, and not just us, but all things. All things. And it's not just a physical statement. It's also this kind of statement. The internal world of the human condition. And so they know not what they do. Or they're clearly blind to the more metaphysical implications. And so you can see here, I say that the I Ching is coming all the way out of the ancient world. Well, it's no accident that it's sharing this kind of shamanistic mentality. So you have these old rulers that switched up the way that this system has happened. There was a time in history where it was an 8 system and not a 6. system. The convention now is that it's a 6, a hexagram. So throughout time, ironically, the Book of Changes went through its own changes in structure. But eventually we come to this hexagram or trigram, 2 trigrams stacked on top of each other, and in the center of this is the Tai Chi symbol, that of which is the yin yang, as it's called. And because that is the core of the whole thing, it's the yin yang. So that symbol that we often see, it's really all around the world now, can hit with a bit more depth now that we can understand some of its historical credo, some of its context. And you have these mythical rulers that have had historical changes, realizations, certain trigrams revealing themselves to them almost supernaturally, altering decisions that were made. And so this was the language of dreams in a certain way, right? In the Western world, you have these, in Sumeria we went over it, in all manner of Western culture, also in paganism, these dreams that made rulers make certain decisions that saved their rulership or built a temple. And in the same way, what language was used to get across to them. So in Sumeria, it was these chimeric forms that would come to like Gidea of Lagesh and show him the way of how to build the temple. Or say the Norse, right? The gods come to you in your dreams and tell you that this is the way to secure your rulership, right? It's the language of the culture coming to you in the context that you can understand it. That is a direct influence from the subconscious realm, or whatever you want to understand dreams as, and has implications as to history. And so you have these rulers that were gifted with the vision of these different trigrams. It's the language that is transmuting. Oh. So, of course, as we've seen several times throughout the course, you have what history says about the I Ching, and then you have what scholars say about the I Ching. And of course, this supernatural stuff goes under the bridge. And also, the length of history of the I Ching is also questioned by modern scholars. And that's true of anything that we'd see across the world, And I'm not going to try to dissect that one too much, but it's just to serve the point of giving this historical context. So, when you speak of Taoism and Confucianism and, these say philosophical methods that come from the ancient world, you must remember and kind of give a measure to the core philosophy of the I Ching to see how it pans out. And of course, with Taoism, you see that flow straight into it, to go from divination into this kind of poetry that gives the philosophy, whether it's the Zhuangzhou or it's the Tao Te Ching from Lao Tzu. And then, of course, you can measure it with comparison to Confucianism. And, maybe that's a little bit more cantankerous. Yeah, a little bit more tricky to line that one up just right. But fundamentally speaking, you might say this divination system would be hammered and hammered and hammered to tell exactly what's coming up in the future. But in truth, the actual divination, as opposed to things like tarot or the conflated end of palmistry, where it's like, we must know the future, when am I going to die? Which is highly impractical, by the way, in truth, when it comes to divination. The Book of Changes in the I Ching, in its actual usage, is much more of this kind of character training. It's not that it's there to tell you the future hard and fast. It's there to equate you with these processes of changes. And so in this way, it's a kind of tool toward enlightenment, lack of a better term, a tool toward understanding the world. So yes, it has some nearness in divinatory properties, but the kind of underhanded ultimate goal of it is to make you acquainted with these processes. It's teaching you while it's telling you, you see. It's a teacher. And all of this goes back to the great old words, know thyself. So this isn't just a divination to get your eyes glowing, you know. It's a divination to teach you about what's going on. What is actually metaphysically going on, and how to align yourself with these changes, and to develop your own psyche to be acclimated to these waxing and waning changes. I mean, take it back to Heraclitus, all is flux, all is flux. So here's to say that how to equate yourself with the flux, how to read the changes. And so this would be disregarded when I Ching is brought back up, especially I think in like the 1800s or the 1700s in the Western world, as fortune telling. And again, you know, real ham-fisted, real oversimplification, real overlooking of what really goes into it. You know, fortune telling, tell me who I'm gonna marry, tell me the lottery numbers, you know, tell me where I can find gold. You know, just like we did with all of our grimoires, obsessing about how to use magic to tell us where a treasure is so we can strike it rich. I mean, that really shows what we're bringing to these wisdom traditions, you know, the mind that we're bringing, the blindness that we're bringing to these wisdom traditions. And so, yet again, right, just to last iterate, the I Ching bringing you the shape of your destiny, so to speak. What things will govern your time here. And it's not about the actual way it looks, right? We want to know the details. It's about the idealism or the root, the kernel in the middle of the processes that we experience. And that's where it's at. For those that have been privy to conjurations or pagan ceremonies or high magic circles, it's not or if you go to the Inipe and you speak with the shaman, spirits will not give you specifics. That's not the world they live in. They're not. You're missing the point if you want specifics in speaking with the spirits. You are going to get the generalities, lack of a better term. You're going to be getting the undercurrent value that is budding out. And you're focusing on the twigs while you should be looking at the roots. So in spirits or in this kind of divination, yet again, this is the point, where we want those specific things. Tell me when and this is going to happen. Tell me what it's going to look like, who's going to be there, yada, yada, yada. And again, missing the point, focusing on the twigs, grasping at leaves. When instead, if we were more realized, if we were more internal, if we were more attuned to what's really going on, then the questions would become, what's going on with the roots? You know, how's this going to spell out in a more metaphysical fashion? So all of life in this way, as a wax and wane of these dualities, good and evil, love and hate, hard and soft, light and dark, warm and cold, you know. So these things will ebb and flow, you know. We'll feel like we're in a really good space, and then we'll go back, and it won't be in such a good space, and this will be a time of greater clarity, and then we'll kind of be shrouded some for a time. And this is what is. This is what is. Not the one or the other, but the both, you know, the ebb and flow. And in all ways, this is the struggle of modern science as well. So, you know, matter, antimatter, you know, positive and negative charges, right? protons and electrons, right? All of this still yet speaking to that yin-yang, So, to kind of step out of that for a bit, you know, and we'll get back on the track of the time wave temporarily. Just give me a minute. I want to focus on something. So, this implication, and we've had this discussion throughout the course too, free will versus fate, right? And so, what does this say? So, when you go to the I Ching and you throw the dice, right, and you get this hexagram, this is to say, the implication here is that probability doesn't exist, or randomness doesn't exist. What you are bringing to the sensation of life, what you are bringing to the coins, is you. And so the way you throw it is going to be the way you throw it. So there's no chance here. There's no randomness. And when you read your readout from each and every I Ching, then you're going to start to itch this that I'm trying to get at. You know, if somebody believes in divination and they see that it really resonates with them and it's really telling them something, then the implication there is that it was meant to be. But even that seems like it's a bit much. It's not that it's meant to be, it's that this is the only way it would be. And so what does that say about free will? And what does that say about destiny? It's a weird mix of the two, it would seem. Because it's saying these processes happen, but there's also this freedom of your alignment with these processes. But there is no way to have a random throw out, you know, a random reading. Oh. So let's talk about McKenna. So Terrence Mckenna propounding this time wave theory, the basis of which is on the I Ching, right? And McKenna and Dennis in the rainforest having their revelatory experiences by use of sacred medicines, right? And happens upon the idea or the inspiration that leads McKenna to the I Ching and using it and noticing a pattern that the hexagrams, the 6 solid lines, and the 64 that are used depending on what set you're applying, that you can take these certain hexagrams and you can also rotate them 180 degrees and put them on themselves, and that some of these pairs will fit perfectly together, they're a match, yin yang, and then others will create a kind of difference that you can measure, a kind of plot, a wave. And this is the time wave, that you're simply taking the different hexagrams in the I Ching and you're flipping it on itself and creating a graph from that. You know, the ones that match are kind of a nullifier, and the ones that don't create the dips in the wave. And so it was a kind of point of genius, or a point of like cunning articulation, that McKenna gave this a shot, because the wisdom that goes into the creation of the hexagrams is already mysterious enough, and now you're taking that mystery and you're kind of exponentiating it and creating this graph, this time wave. And you can go and see this time wave, the original design. It's provided on the internet. You can find it easily. But when you have this graph, then what happens? That's the question. And so the ascribing to what this graph means, right? So you have it, so what does this mean? And the word that comes ringing is novelty. Novelty meaning this kind of newness, this increase of newness in the world. So what are some novel happenings? Well, the internet, the onset of the internet, is something that changed the progression of history in a very real way. Things could never go back to the way that they were before because something novel happened, and now it's going a very different way than what was expected. So novelty is almost the opposite of what we expect from the world. We think that it's going to go this way, and then what happens? It goes a very completely ineffable way. Something that almost could have never been predicted. And that's novelty. You know, to have these creatures, these early Homo sapiens, you know, the first time they pick up a tool, that was a novelty. That changed the course. That changed the way the things were going to happen from that point forward. Again, novelty. So that is the attribute ascribed to the wave, that this wave seemingly measures these great discoveries, these great changes, these great inventions. So this ebb and flow is between yin and yang, but also through what is now ascribed as novelty and stability. The times, you know, when it dips, it's stability or constant. And oftentimes that's what we want. We want things to be certain. We want it to be constant. You got these people chasing eternal life, researching telomeres, trying to make humanity live forever. That is this asinine, neurotic chase for constant. But then sometimes we're sick of it. And that's when we want change or novelty, where something juicy comes up and it makes it a good show. And so that's the idea that was come upon. And this idea wasn't purely McKenna's. This novelty wave wasn't purely McKenna's. McKenna happened across the wave, right, in that articulation. But really, the novelty idea goes back to Alfred North Whitehead. And this guy was, during the early 1900s, a mathematician first. And early on was just that, a mathematician, focusing on logic and physics. You know, the real black and white, type A sort of stuff, you know, publishing works like the Principia Mathematica, right? And was involved in these very influential circles, but eventually, in say the late 1910s, 1920s, he begins to shift his focus to the philosophy of science and metaphysics. And with this, puts out this piece, Processes and Reality. And notice the word, processes, right? So it's taking this idea, Whitehead is, that everything is about processes. That everything is fundamentally constructed by processes. And to obsess about constructive materialism, or just materialism in general, matter, to obsess about physicality, is missing the point. Because what's really going on are processes. And see, you see how this is all coming together now? So Whitehead is really the one that pitches this idea of novelty. And just to familiarize ourselves with the mentality of Whitehead, let's go through a quote. Creativity is the principle of novelty. Creativity introduces novelty into the content of the many, which are the universe disjunctively. The creative advance is the application of this ultimate principle of creativity to each novel situation which it originates. The ultimate metaphysical principle is the advance from the disjunction to the conjunction, creating a novel entity other than the entities given in disjunction. The novel entity is at once the togetherness of the many, which it finds, and also in one among the disjunctive many, which it leaves. So here, over and over again, the novel entity, this process, to kind of continue with the quote. Thus, the production of novel togetherness is the ultimate notion embodied in the term concrescence. And, what term, when you listen to all these Terrence Mckenna lectures, he loves that word, concrescence. And where's he getting this from, right? Oh. This production, the ultimate notions of the production of novelty and concrete togetherness are inexplicable either in terms of their higher universals or in terms of components participating in the concrescence. And all of this just is to say, the original point that I was getting at is it's about the process, He's basically taking this work to take a hammer to all this obsession with materiality, and that we can think that things are this way, we can apply this theory to all of physics, but we are always eluding, we are always not looking at this novel category of reality, this creativity that comes about. And all this talk of his disjunction versus conjunction, the disjunction is inconstant, but when things come together beautifully, that is because of creativity. Creativity, in that kind of eye that you can apply to the world, is the one that brings together the harmony, is the one that brings it all together in a way. Here's here's a classic philosophical quandary. Did Leibniz or Newton discover or invent calculus? And what is the use of calculus? Well, that was a realization of creativity to bring this all together in a way that is observable. And so in this way, this philosophy that I'm painting seems to imply that this is not an invention. It is a discovery. And here's what I really want to get at, and what I'll touch on later. It's not that anything is new. It's that people can officially see it. They've turned their eyes and are now observing it. So it's not that it was never there. It was always there. Whatever it is, calculus, quantum particles, what have you. The implication here is that things are always there. All these processes, all the unknown, all the interdimensionality, all the things beyond our scope are always happening, and our seeing of them is the newness, what we call newness. Anyhow, back to Mckenna, and to stay on subject. His quote, "History is the shockwave of eschatology. Something is at the end of time, and it is casting an enormous shadow over human history, drawing all human becoming toward it. All the wars, the philosophies, the rapes, the pillaging, the migrations, the cities, the civilizations, all of this is occupying a microsecond of geological, planetary, and galactic time as the monkeys react to the symbiotic, which is the environment which is feeding information to humanity about the larger picture." So again, you're starting to get into this mind. Now, the mathematics of the time wave and its application is perfectly logical, perfectly perfect. The question here and the problem is, how do we apply this time wave? Where do we set it, What is novel and what isn't novel? So then comes the subjectivity. So the very existence of the time wave is not to be questioned. What it's metaphysically stating is sonorously true. However, the application of it is really where the faults start to trickle in. Because, say we start the grid at the invention or the use of the atomic bomb. Which one? Is it when the idea struck of how to separate, the molecules? Maybe I'm getting that wrong. I'm not a physicist. Or was it when it was used? Which of those two is the novel event? Or either of these a novel event? So then comes the subjectivity of how to apply the time wave, which is ultimately where its downfall can be wrought. Now, what's interesting about this is McKenna's kind of twist on it. The eschaton. What's that about? What about the eschaton? And tying it to this Mayan calendar, right? Because he was plotting it from the nuke and using it to modern history and applying it to the 0 point that the wave creates, a 0 point. And that is when it seemingly goes completely still. And there's two ways to interpret that. Is that an ever-ending constant? Is that the end, per se? The time wave going to that 0 point, is that the end? Or is it infinite novelty, right? That it literally becomes so novel that it's untraceable. And what does that look like? And the best term is in the eschaton. And the eschaton just means the final thing. In Greek, it just is the eschatos, which is the last logi, the last study, which literally would mean the study of that which is last, implying that there is an end, which if we look across the world as we have, this is a very big metaphysical leap. If you look at Hinduism, and you look at the kalpas, you look at the yugas, then you already know that time is cyclical by this conception, that there is no end, or at the very least, if there is an end, it's always leading to a beginning, that it wraps around itself, Ouroboros style. The end leads to the beginning leads to the end, yada, yada, yada. And round we go. And thus, the samsara. And then you look over at, say, like Baha'i, and it's to say that each of these revelations or seeming apocalypses are simply just a further unraveling of the messages given throughout time by God. So each terrible thing or big novel event that can be interpreted as an apocalypse is simply a further unraveling of the ultimate truth that we're slowly opening our eyes to. However, in the Western world, there has been this preoccupation, as I've covered before in the End of the World talk, this rampant preoccupation with the fact that there is an end. There must be an end. And this is a kind of mirroring of our own death and an obsessive nature, an obsession with our own death. To think that applies to everything. And as I broke it down before, what do you mean by the end of the world? Are you meaning the end of existence itself, that it just is snap done? Or do you mean the end of us? But all the animals will be around, is that an end? Or will grass not grow in a field? Will trees not root? And if that's so, then is that the end that you're talking about? Will the planet just be this barren thing? Is that the end? Is that the end of everything? Is it seemingly the end of all sentient life in the universe? What do you mean? The end of the world as we know it? How many times have we been through that? We're not in a world that we recognize at all. Okay. So to this degree, it seems a term of convenience that McKenna is using, the eschaton. I don't know if people should have applied such a heaviness to how he was using that word. Because what is a revelation? What is an apocalypse other than moving into a time of which we do not recognize anymore? And to be fair, since 2012 or 2016 or even 2020, do we recognize this world anymore? Is this the world of the 90s? No. So there's a fluidity to how you can interpret that kind of usage. And really having a hard set date, the solstice of the winter solstice of 2012, would it be that it's got to happen on the day, or is that simply kind of a weird measuring point where it's this kind of fluidity that moves from after that point forward? So don't throw it all out the window. Ho ho. So the trick of this and all that, this measurement of how to apply the time wave, subjective. Does that mean that the whole time wave itself and all the ideas therein is garbage? 100% no. 100% no. To think that we could have a graph that would measure the processes that are the fundamental nature of reality is wild and seemingly resonant with truth. However, the trick just comes, how do we understand that? And better yet, how to apply that in a way that's honoring of this kind of truth. And this 0 point, here's an interesting implication, right? So to apply the macrocosm to the microcosm here, we want to think about the universe, we want to think about humanity. Well, think about you, right? And the time wave would seem to imply that everything starts rather slow. And McKenna always preached that, entropy is folding in on itself and novelty is getting more and more intense. Well, let's apply this. When you were a kid, things went rather slow, right? Days were long, years were lifetimes. And then as you get older, things move quickly, more and more quickly, more and more quickly. And then you apply this same human experience to civilization. The early world, the early primordial Gaia, very little was going on. A lot was going on, but in the way of novelty, in the way of change, things took millions of years. And this, in big time, the early cosmos was, billions, right? And so it was this slow thing, this slow thing. And then now, look at what's happening, as by our interpretation, novelty. Things change. Things are moving quickly. Things are happening. And so what we're seeing in history is a mirrorment, is what we're seeing in our own experience on the individual basis. So what does that say? Well, there's a lot of ways to do this inner-outer flip, man. I mean, no mistake that we have a big boy God, right? Because we were raised, very likely, most people, or by the very tradition, by dad. Dad was the ruling dude. So of course God's gotta be a big ruling dude. And so we're applying our subjective cultural sensation to a way of explaining or understanding the greater reality. And so in this way, we live life in such a way, right, where it was all slow before and now it's fast, and that's just the way that childhood and adulthood happen via the human condition. And so here we are again, experiencing that subjectively, applying it to what we call the objective, as if it doesn't, isn't intertwined with or rooted from our subjectivity. So, okay, I'm getting off the point. Terrence Mckenna calling this all a move towards a transcendental object at the end of time. And that seemingly is yet another allegory for death. What are we moving toward? All these changes, all these things, what's it all on about? And the seeming only answer to that is something to do with death. And that is a question at the heart of every religion, at the heart of every mythology. The eschaton, the apocalypse, the end of the world, as I already said, is just this weird understanding of death itself. That me, myself, moving toward death is me moving towards the eschaton. And so to apply that subjective reality to the objective world, you see. Ayay. And before I close, I want to go on one other little rant here. So another way to just completely dissolve this into soupy soup. What we interpret as a novel event is purely based on the meaning that we bring into the world. It doesn't have meaning of itself. Do you think microbes and bacteria stopped doing what they did for however long in the whole universe when we discovered and started using the internet? Do you think that changed them? I mean, you could argue that on a very, interconnected level, it changed it, right? But fundamentally, do you think anything changed? No. We're tinkering around and we have our own little world, what a novel event. World War One, the breaking out of World War One. What a novel event. Do you think that changed the way that raccoons hunt? We're our own obsession with this internal imagination that we've come up with, this collective imagination. I mean, the words that I'm using. If I want to understand a language, what do? I have to tap into the mind of the people that use that language. I have to start thinking as they think and applying the utterances, the sounds, to the ideas that are in the minds of those people, and then I'm on my way to understanding the language. Well, what does that mean? It means that all the language is a collective imagination. The ideas that we've picked out of the endless soup of our minds to say that these are things because we have given them word. Now, all of this is just for me to say, how can we really say what novel is and what constant is? How can we really say where to apply this graph? You see what I'm saying? It's really soupy stuff. And change is what it's about. Change is what we observe. Change in our relationships. Change in how we relate. Change in how we perceive reality. And at most, what can we take away from all this, right? One thing to really hammer home is the heart of the I Ching. That we can align ourselves with these processes, that we can humble ourselves in such a way that we are open to these processes, that when change comes knocking on the door, you are laid spread eagle naked on the floor. You're ready, and you're not going to grasp at things that aren't even real anymore. You're willing to experience the dream as it unfolds. Ooh. And something else I want to get to. This making of the novelty wave is a great, for collaborative religion perspective, is a great example of how the modern world is really keeping things fresh. So with McKenna here, you're taking words from a physicist, a philosopher of science. You're taking an ancient mysticism, and now you're bringing it together in mathematics. You're bringing it together in a plot line. So you're taking these various things from different parts of the world in different times, and you're mixing it all together to create something novel. So this is where I say the novelty wave is in fact a very novel thing. And it's a real testament of what we should hope for in the world, that in the future and in the modern day, we are bringing what seem like things that shouldn't be getting along, i.e. ancient mysticism and science, together in such a way that are creating something that's never been seen. And this is an argument for digital shamanism, to take the ancient shamanism, the wisdoms therein, and to integrate it with what has modernly been discovered, that this is a whole new world and that there's a lot of hope in what novelty can be conjured therein. I mean, in all the problems that we think are unmutable, unchangeable, something comes along, Our problem with plastics, okay, well, here are these guys coming up with all of these mushroom casts, that are biodegradable. Bam! Problem novelly solved. Creativity, that all of it's here. Okay, I'm just going to stop there.